In today's episode, Forrest Morgeson comes back to the show. He chairs marketing at Michigan State University, and he's an expert on customer satisfaction and loyalty. We unlock the fascinating ways our political identities shape our brand loyalties, often in surprising ways. Together, we dig into why those at political extremes can become fiercely loyal, even defending companies when things go south, and how that deep emotional connection can both help and hurt customer well-being. What surprised me the most was how these customers often pay more and stick around, even when better deals are right in front of them. You'll walk away with actionable insights on how to spot, serve, and ethically manage loyalty in today's polarized world, and maybe even rethink what truly drives your best customers. Today on the Delighted Customers podcast, I'm excited to bring back to the show Forrest Morgeson, who is an associate professor in the Department of Marketing at the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. He's also the faculty member who I report to as a member of the faculty myself, as a professor of practice, and it's been a pleasure. He's serving as the interim chairperson of the marketing department and was previously co-director of the doctoral program in marketing. He teaches marketing management, marketing strategy, and a whole bunch of great other things at MSU. And his background is really interesting because he's been very involved in the ACSI, which is the Customer Satisfaction Index that takes a look at different sectors and industries and government and gives us a sense of how consumers view these different sectors over time, and tell us a story about how we're doing overall and maybe identify some opportunities for tweaking. In his background, he has also been involved in writing papers, and one particular area of research that we're going to talk about today involves something that we have not talked about at all on the show before, and that is how people who are on both sides of the political spectrum connect to the loyalty, the degree of loyalty that they have to their organization. So with that long intro, Forrest, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Forrest, can you tell us, there's been a lot of research, I'm sure, over time about different segments and different ways that companies try to understand their customer base or their potential customer base, one of which would look at where people align politically and how well or not so well they can try to engage that customer base. What was the white space for your research in this area that didn't exist before?
It's a good question. I think, if you look back over the research, particularly in marketing, a big new interest in how a changing political landscape was impacting what marketers were doing, how they were understanding their customers, started about 15 years ago. And that coincides pretty closely with the rise in what some people have called the hyper-partisan era in American politics. There tends to be a great deal of partisanship and polarization that has really emerged since the late double O's, I think. But it really began to be noticed by folks in political psychology and political science about 15 years ago. And so a lot of literature grew in those disciplines, and that impacted marketing. And marketers started taking a stronger interest in how are these changing political conditions going to impact our ability to sell to customers? Is it changing the way customers perceive us and interact with us? And that's sort of the genesis of our interest in this research, my colleagues and I. We've been working on the paper for a few years now, and one of the things that sets our study aside a little bit is that a lot of the literature that has come earlier had a natural tendency to compare and contrast the liberal consumer and the conservative consumer. What our paper is focused on is another element of political polarization, which is the movement towards the extremes on the political spectrum on both the left and the right. And what we really do is compare and contrast those more politically extreme individuals with your moderates, your centrists, your folks who aren't political at all, sort of in the middle there. And so that's our jumping off point in comparing and contrasting those. And we treat them very much as customer segments, the political extreme versus the political center, and we make the comparisons there.
So did you have a thesis going into this?
I could tell you exactly how the idea came to my mind when we first started working on the paper. I was reading a lot of literature which was doing these compare and contrasts. Conservatives tend to be more X, liberals tend to be more Y. I said I've existed in both worlds, places where I'm surrounded by relatively conservative people, and I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's a relatively strong liberal population. And I found something fundamentally wrong about the stories that were being told, or incomplete about the stories that were being told, in that I said, there's a lot more similarity between the far left and the far right than people think there is. It's sort of, to quote a famous work on the topic from 75 years ago, political extremists tend to be of the same mind. Strong political movements and strong political ideologies tend to attract very similar people. It's just they branch off, some to the left and some to the right, but the same type of people are in those two categories. And that was the kernel of an idea, and we started gathering data and looking at it, and it turns out, at least according to what we're writing, it turns out to be correct that there are a lot of similarities between those groups.
Set this up for us in terms of how you began to set up the research and why you set it up that way.
We first turned to some secondary data that we already had available, and you mentioned the American Customer Satisfaction Index earlier. Within that data, we've got, as you mentioned, a whole bunch of customer satisfaction ratings or interviews of individual consumers for a wide array of different companies. For some of that data, we already had data on their political leanings, their political affiliation or political ideology, because it was tied to a segmentation variable we had for the federal government studies that we were doing. So we had a pretty sizable data set where we had both customers' ratings of their satisfaction with companies, their loyalty to companies, and so forth, as well as those same customers' political affiliation. And so that's the data we started with, and it sort of confirmed our hypotheses. And then we did some additional studies in controlled environments where we could have treatment and control groups and tease out the effects a little bit more from a causal perspective. And we set the study up that way.
Okay. And if you don't mind sharing, what were the top 2 or 3 key findings, and what surprised you the most?
2 or 3 key findings. I mean, we've got a wealth of findings. We all fall in love with our own papers, but we got a wealth of findings in this particular paper. We find that politically extreme customers are, in fact, more loyal to brands. We also find that they tend to be more satisfied customers of the companies with which they're interacting. If you think about, the really politically intense people out there, they tend to be really loyal to their ideas, to their ideology, to their political parties. And there's a spillover effect where that also seems to apply to companies. So they tend to be really satisfied, brand loyal. And if you go from a sort of a typical marketing perspective, you would consider those to be some of your most valuable customers, those strong loyalists. We find that this holds, and in fact, the effect is accentuated for politically extreme customers when they're faced with what we call threats. So if they complain to the company, they have some kind of a service failure, they complain to the company, they actually tend to get more loyal following that. Politically extreme customers, that is, tend to get more loyal after these kinds of, we differentiate between internal and external threats, but we see that the effect is accentuated, meaning that what happens for the politically extreme folks is that sort of a defense mechanism kicks in, and they reject disconfirming evidence of the of excellence of the brand to which they are loyal. So even in troubled times, they tend to be more loyal customers, and even more so than the customers in the middle. So that, I think, is another important finding. We look at some of the boundary conditions. We also frame it, though, as something of a negative for customers, only some upside to having more politically intense or politically extreme customers for companies. For the customers themselves, we find that there are some negative implications to this. So one thing that we do, both through that big secondary data set we have and some additional controlled studies, is we look at these customers' reaction to price increases by the firm. And what we find is that even when presented with an alternative product or service that's virtually identical in terms of its quality, in terms of its features, the more politically extreme customers won't switch. They'll stay with their brand at a higher price point, even when there's an alternative that would be financially beneficial to them. So we see there being some consumer well-being drawbacks to the more politically extreme customers, and some things that may have a more sort of regulatory dimension to it in how consumers are targeted by companies. Are they being targeted because of their political extremism, with companies knowing that these folks are willing to pay more for products and services? And so it is sort of a mixed bag, and we're excited to see the results come out there because I think they have pretty important ramifications.
As you're sharing the relationship between politically extreme customers and loyalty, I can't help but think of, in the course that I teach, we go over something called Oliver's Framework for Loyalty. And in his framework, he talks about the 4 stages of loyalty. And the deepest, the first stage is really all about functionality or convenience. Yeah, they shop, and as you go deeper, there's like a preference for brand. Now, I actually prefer your brand over another brand if all things were equal. And then you go deeper down, and there's like this emotional connection to the brand where I'm identifying personally with the brand. And I couldn't think of a more direct correlation in terms of the conversation with Oliver's framework of that 4th stage and what you're talking about, because you've got both the emotion and the personal identification with the brand.
Absolutely.
Say more about that.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up. One of the things we found, and this study actually isn't being used in the current version of our paper right now, but a couple of years ago, we went into the study and found that more politically extreme customers tend to assume that the company they do business with shares their political identity. So if you just cold ask a person with no knowledge about a company's who they donate to, or is the CEO left or right, or anything like that, you ask someone on the left or the right that's more extreme in their political views, hey, what political affiliation do you believe this company has? They're going to say, yeah, oh yeah, they're identified with me. They're like me, right? And I think that gets to the emotional attachment you're talking about. Sort of a strong bond between consumer and company is assumed to exist, even with no objective evidence to that end.
And that would be kind of a fun little research to do and say, my mind goes right to Tide, like detergent, and Procter and Gamble. And, could it be that you have someone who says, oh yeah, Procter & Gamble's definitely conservative, they think the way I do, and the next person saying, oh yeah, they're liberal, they believe what I believe.
Yeah. That's essentially it, right? I think part of it again gets to, an attempt on the part of these more politically intense individuals to shield themselves from cognitive dissonance, right? They don't want to believe that they might be doing business with a brand that is opposed to their strong political identity. And so the default assumption is that, yeah, I really like this brand. They must share my political identity. And unless I have information otherwise, I'm going to assume that they do. Getting that information, and this is something we do look at in the paper, that disconfirming information can upset that connection between customer, politically extreme customer, and brand. If they find evidence that more clearly identifies this company with the other side, then that loyalty relationship weakens. That's another study we do in the paper. The misalignment scenario, where they find that their company is in fact not aligned with their political identity, that weakens the relationship between political extremism and brand loyalty.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk about some ideas that business leaders can leverage based on some of the research that you're getting very close to publishing. But I want to double click on the 4th level that Oliver talks about in terms of that loyalty that is deep. And we hadn't planned to talk about this, it's just coming to my mind now, is he talks about not only at this 4th level are they buy the product, a repeat purchase, they will buy even at a slightly higher price than their peer group. They will forgive mistakes when you mess up. But then the last piece of it is, so they're very sticky, but the last piece of it is they'll defend the brand. And that sounds like what you were talking about. It's like, even if it kind of defies logic a little bit, their emotions kick in and they defend the brand.
Absolutely. And that, again, very much fits in with our finding for this particular segment of what we call politically extreme customers. One of the phrases that we use a couple of times is they become brand evangelists,
Mm.
very much like politically extreme customers do when it comes to their ideology. They'll stand up and say, no, you are absolutely wrong. This is the right way. And they'll do the same thing for companies. They're more likely to engage in positive word of mouth about companies. And even in times of some kind of objective failure that they experience, they not only tend to maintain that evangelical nature, they get stronger in their defense of the brand in those troubled times. No, 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 no. This wasn't their fault, right? This couldn't be their fault. It's somebody else's fault. They'll take that kind of in defense of their own political identity to some extent. They'll defend the brand even when it fails.
CX professionals know that every touch point matters, but managing the entire customer journey can be challenging, especially for enterprises due to disjointed data, difficulty aligning stakeholders, and struggling to secure executive support. And that's where JourneyTrack comes in. JourneyTrack integrates journey mapping management and measurement, allowing you to pinpoint friction, optimize experiences, and demonstrate the ROI of CX initiatives. So you can align teams, break down silos, and then you can track improvements in real time. With JourneyTrack, you can get visibility across every channel and touch point. No more guesswork, just clear insights and measurable results. Join the CX leaders who transform journeys into improved experiences with impactful business outcomes like reduced churn and increased customer lifetime value. Visit journeytrack.io today and see how better journeys lead to better business. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, looking at it from a macro standpoint, that, good, yes, for the company, more profits because they're less likely to leave over price differences, but bad maybe for the consumer in that maybe it's not in their own best interest to pick a particular brand that, is maybe there's one that's less expensive
Sure.
that
That's right.
provide the same functionality. Or obviously value gets tricky, right? Because value starts to bring an emotion.
Right. Value is different, but what we do look at it in this study is actual price paid, and we're able to manipulate that, right? So, you take a product and you say you're really loyal to this product. Okay, now they raise their price by 25%. A competitive product that has the same features, same quality, same attributes, etc., is available for purchase. Do you buy the other objectively less expensive but otherwise equal product? And they say no. And so there comes a point when that's harmful to consumer well-being, right? We want to try to make sure that we're setting up a situation where consumers are doing what's in their own best financial interest, particularly now when we've got, prices increasing for a range of goods and services. You would hope that consumers have the tools necessary to make sure that they're making the right choices and picking things that are, financially responsible for them as consumers. So there is a downside to it from that perspective.
You're sounding more like an economics professor when you get into that than a marketing professor.
Well, consumer well-being is important, right? And I think in the marketing discipline as a whole, we've paid much more attention to the ethical dimensions of marketing. And I think that's a good thing. I think we need to make sure that what we're doing in marketing, yes, is helpful to the bottom line of the firm, is creating profit for businesses. And that's our goal in business schools all over the world. At the same time, we want to also make sure that consumers have the tools and resources needed to make good decisions that are right for them and for their own economic situation. And I don't really see a conflict in that. I mean, we're in an age now where a lot of companies are paying more than lip service to being good social partners, right? To being partners with consumers and doing all of the things that, we classify under ESG now, or sustainability and that sort of thing. And having sustainable consumers, right? Consumers that are making wise decisions is in the best interest for companies in the long run as well.
So what outcomes would you say the research points to that could help businesses leverage the info, the data that you will produce here to talking about sustainable competitive advantage, but also without exploiting customers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest thing that this study does is it sort of, from one perspective, it points to a group of customers that you can expect are going to be, more loyal, more committed to your brand, less sensitive to price increases that you may need to make as a firm. And, obviously, if you look across the United States, there's lots of places that you can identify geographically and say, okay, our company in this area is probably going to, see some positive outcomes from the type of consumer that we have there. And so I think that's, a fairly straightforward, just even if it's just to understand the data that you're getting back from, say, surveying that you're doing of customers and their reaction to your brand, this can help clarify what you're seeing in the data to some extent. And, I think for positive or negative, this trend is likely to proceed for a while. We're going to have a higher proportion of more politically extreme customers in the population. And so, understanding that just from a neutral perspective and understanding what it might do to the data that you're seeing back, for example, is important. I think it also gives us sort of a call as marketers to say, okay, we want to make sure that we're behaving in an ethical manner in how we're targeting and segmenting customers. We don't want to in any way, shape, or form be responsible for increased political extremism, for example, right? We don't want to take advantage of consumers in that way. We want to make sure that we're doing this in an ethical manner as well. This finding can help firms that are so inclined, understand that they're dealing with this kind of customer and what may or may not be the right path in marketing to them.
So, we see, you can't help but watch, let's say, TV commercials, for instance, and built into the design of the commercial, whoever architected the commercial, some either with the people involved, the animals involved, children involved in the commercial, perhaps there's a tilt toward one side or the other. And my guess is that when they thought through the storyboard of the commercial, they considered this audience that was political in one way or another. And could you, for maybe this be third rail a little bit, because we try and stay, for those listening, we try and stay clear of politics, religion, sin, goods, and services. But at the same time here, we're talking about a legitimate marketing question. And here I'm setting up the scenario of a TV commercial that could, with intention, they're storyboarding, they know their audience. To what extent, I guess, could this thing like backfire? They're selling something to the company, let's say it's a marketing agency, to the company that's going to get them better business results. What are the risks there of kind of tilting too far in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, that's not really, like you said, the core question in our paper is looking at folks, both left and right, just people who tend to be more politically extreme, engaged, intense, whatever the word that you want to use, folks that are just more strongly political. And so we're not really looking at, we look at misalignment where, we present the liberal customer with a conservative scenario and see how that impacts it. But other than that, we're not really trying to sort of make comparisons left versus right. What you're talking about is, and there's a growing literature about this in marketing, finance is talking about, management's talking about it, but what we call socio-political activism on the part of firms. And more firms are doing that. They're taking a stand on an issue one way or another. It may be something that they put into their marketing campaigns, their marketing communications. It may be the way that they talk to their shareholders. It may be the political donations being made by the firm to different parties or groups. But more and more firms are doing that. And I think what the research, and this is a big body of growing research that's changing, but I think in general what it shows is watch out for misalignment. If you are going to do that kind of thing, intentionally or unintentionally, and you're not fully aware of who your customers are and how they're going to respond to this, then you can get in a lot of trouble. And we've seen these kind of political firestorms happen to firms a lot over the last 10 to 15 years, where they provide a new product or communicate that product, advertise that product in a way that's fundamentally in opposition with the largest share of their customers. It doesn't even need to be a majority. It can just be a plurality of customers, right? The largest group within their segment along some dimension is fundamentally put off by the way that they're that they're acting or advertising and so forth. And that's when trouble starts, right? When you manage to, and we have very recent examples of this that were really high profile. If you do that kind of misalignment, even if you think it'll go unnoticed or you think it's for the greater good, you risk alienating a sizable proportion of the people buying your products, and that's a problem.
When you said there was a couple of recent examples, would you mind sharing one or two?
We've seen some blowback to Target over the last 12 months and some of the things that they've done. The Bud Light case, I guess that's a couple of years ago now, but that was pretty visible, a pretty visible political firestorm for that company. I don't even know if their sales have rebounded from that for that particular product, but those are the kind of things. As a political partisan, may agree or disagree with what they're doing, but as a marketer, you have to say, okay, you need to make sure that what you're doing is not going to offend a sizable portion of your customer base, because that's just bad for business.
Excellent. Great conversation. I didn't expect to get into Oliver's framework, but this does affect customer loyalty and in an interesting way. And I can't wait till your research comes out. I'm sure you can't either.
I can't either.
But with that, I want to end with the same question I asked all my guests. Now, I switched about, around episode 100, and I think you were on when I was asking customers what advice would they give to their 20-year-old self. But now I've switched it because the name of the show is called the Delighted Customers Podcast. What delights you as a customer?
Can I answer the first question first?
You can.
My first answer would be buy Apple. My 20-year-old self, I would say find $10,000 somewhere. It's 1992. Buy all the Apple stock you can, and just sit on it. Just hold.
You'd be sitting on a pile of cash.
I would be sitting on 7 or 8 figures. What delights me as a customer, and I always find the gap between my research and my practical life as a consumer. I'm a no-nonsense customer. So a lot of people in marketing now are focused on things like customer engagement and customer delight and, these kinds of the full customer experience and think of the journey and all of those stuff. I tend to be a no-nonsense customer. So I want it. I want what I want. I want a fair price for it. I want to get in and out. I don't want to talk. I don't want frills. I think there's still space for those kind of customers. I think we're more numerous than marketers believe sometimes, or customer experience folks believe. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a customer is have a frictionless encounter that gets them what they want and they get out, and that's that. And if you do that, they'll come back for another frictionless, no nonsense, no frills kind of encounters. I guess that's what delights me as a customer, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Great conversation. If people wanted to get a hold of you to connect, what would be the best way?
You can find me all over the internet, but at my Michigan State University, go to the marketing page. You'll find me on the front page there. I love to field questions from folks and chat about the research that I'm doing.
Thanks so much, Forrest. Pleasure to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, YouTube viewers. Thanks for watching the Delighted Customers podcast here on YouTube. If you found value in today's conversation, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. That way you'll never miss our weekly episodes with industry leaders sharing their strategies and insights that can transform your approach to customer experience and change leadership. Your subscription helps us reach more professionals like you who are passionate about creating meaningful change in their organizations. Thanks for being a part of our community, and I'll see you in the next episode.